What happens when the one who mocks your courage has to depend on it to survive? Can a single heartbeat decide who's truly brave and who's just pretending? The captain laughed when she entered the briefing room that morning, her uniform pressed, her step steady, a small, faded medal glinting on her chest. He called it decoration for decoration's sake, and the crew chuckled behind him. She didn't answer. She simply saluted, the kind of salute that carries history, not pride. That night, the storm came without warning. Thunder tore open the sky, and waves rose like mountains around the ship. When the engines failed and the alarms wailed, chaos erupted on deck. But through the smoke and rain, she moved quietly, issuing calm, precise commands while everyone else shouted and panicked. Then it hit the captain, the way she gripped the helm, the way she read the wind. This wasn't her first storm. Not even close. What if the woman he mocked was the only one who knew how to bring them home? Hours later, when dawn finally broke, the sea lay calm and the ship floated, scarred but alive. The captain stood before her, drenched and trembling, unable to speak. The same medal he'd ridiculed shimmered under the sunrise. Because true rank isn't worn on your chest. It's proven when the storm calls your name. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the naval base in streaks of orange and violet. But the air felt heavy, almost electric, as if it were holding its breath. The docks were nearly deserted, except for the low hum of distant engines and the occasional clang of metal against metal. A muted rhythm that echoed through the empty corridors of the warships lined like sleeping giants. A soft breeze carried the scent of salt and oil, tangling with the faint aroma of wet canvas and rusting steel. Inside the command center, fluorescent lights buzzed quietly, flickering now and then, casting long, uneasy shadows across the walls lined with maps, monitors, and scattered reports. The room smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and the subtle metallic tang of tension. Every creak of the floor beneath boots sounded magnified. Every shuffled paper seemed to drum against the silence. Officers moved like cautious predators, speaking in low, clipped tones, their eyes darting between screens and each other, aware that even the smallest mistake could ripple through the day with consequences they couldn't yet imagine. Outside, the sea pressed against the hull with a soft, persistent rhythm, whispering its own warning. The waves, calm for now, promised nothing, yet each small lapping seemed amplified in the quiet, almost counting down to something unseen. Seagulls circled high above, their cries harsh and abrupt, slicing the otherwise steady hum of the evening. In the captain's quarters, the medal she had worn all day glinted faintly under the dim light, catching the eye of anyone who glanced her way. The storm on the horizon had not yet arrived, but the sky hinted at it. Clouds gathered like smoke, heavy and low, carrying the scent of coming rain and the unspoken weight of what was to come. A single fan spun lazily above, stirring the warm, salty air, but it did nothing to relieve the sense of waiting, the kind of tense pause that makes time feel both slow and unbearable. Every officer, every sailor, and even the walls themselves seemed to hold their breath, sensing that the night would demand courage, decisiveness, and a reckoning they could neither avoid nor predict. It was a quiet before the storm, a silence pregnant with possibility, where one decision could change the course of everything, and where the line between mockery and respect, fear and admiration, hung thinner than the shadow of a medal glinting in the fading light. The young officer stepped onto the deck with a quiet confidence that immediately drew attention, though she didn't seek it. Her uniform, perfectly pressed, bore the faint glint of a small, weathered medal, the kind that told stories she never shared aloud. Every movement was measured, deliberate, almost imperceptibly commanding. When she walked past a group of junior sailors, they instinctively straightened, not out of fear, but out of respect for someone whose presence demanded it. Her eyes, dark and unwavering, scanned the horizon, the instruments, and the crew with a precision that suggested she had seen more than anyone could guess. The captain, by contrast, was loud in his authority. He thrived on the visible hierarchy, the unquestioned compliance of those beneath him. He had a booming voice that carried across the deck, a presence that filled the room before he even spoke. Yet, there was a subtle tension beneath his bravado, a need to assert control over the unpredictable, over those who might challenge his carefully maintained order. He glanced at the young officer with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes, amused at her quiet composure. In his mind, this was a game of image versus reality, and she seemed almost too calm, too precise. Around them, the crew mirrored the atmosphere. Some whispered when they thought no one could hear, comparing her calm focus to the captain's commanding bluster. A few exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the unspoken rivalry, the subtle clash of skill and ego that simmered just beneath the surface. Even the ship itself seemed to respond to their presence. The engines hummed with expectation, the steel deck gleamed in the fading light, and the ropes and rigging carried a tension that mirrored the human dynamics above. When the young officer issued an order, it was crisp, almost imperceptibly sharp, and yet carried a quiet authority that made compliance feel like a choice, not an obligation. The captain, in turn, barked his own instructions, more out of habit than necessity, and yet a few sailors paused, caught between following instinct and recognizing true competence. In those first moments together, the contrast was clear. The captain, loud and visible, commanding attention. The officer, silent and precise, commanding respect. Neither had yet revealed the full measure of their capabilities, but the air between them crackled with the potential of what was to come. Every glance, every gesture, every clipped word was a test, a subtle negotiation of power, one that would define the course of the night when the storm finally hit. The storm had not yet broken, but the first cracks of chaos were already whispering across the deck. Clouds churned low on the horizon, casting jagged shadows that crept across the steel hull. The young officer stood near the helm, eyes scanning the instruments, lips pressed into a thin line. Her hands moved with precise efficiency, adjusting dials and checking readings that no one else seemed to notice. Every subtle movement radiated calm, a contrast to the rising murmur of unease among the crew. The captain approached, boots heavy against the deck, his shadow falling over her. He leaned slightly, trying to appear casual, but there was an edge in the set of his jaw. "You think you're ready for this?" he asked, voice carrying that practiced mockery. A small smirk played across his lips, but his eyes were sharper than he intended. She didn't look up immediately. Her fingers didn't falter on the instruments. Finally, she spoke, calm, clipped, but unwavering, prepared enough to keep everyone alive. "Are you?" The words hung in the air, heavier than the first distant thunder. The captain straightened, a flicker of irritation crossing his face before he masked it with a controlled chuckle. "Bold words for someone with a single medal on her chest," he said, voice low enough to suggest it was a private joke, yet everyone within a few meters heard it. The crew shifted uneasily, sensing the tension that neither spoke openly. The officer's gaze finally met his, steady, unyielding. "That medal isn't for show," she said, voice soft but edged with authority. "It's proof. Proof that I've handled situations far worse than a little storm." A tense silence followed. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at uniforms and ropes, as if the elements themselves were leaning in to listen. The captain's fingers drummed on the railing, a subtle gesture of control slipping into impatience. "We'll see," he muttered, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Then, the first alarms began to blare, a minor system failure, insignificant on paper, yet it drew the eyes of the entire crew. Panic flickered across their faces, a fleeting reminder of human fragility. The young officer was already moving, giving orders with crisp precision. The captain barked his own commands, louder this time, but the crew's ears followed hers first, almost instinctively. The storm had not yet arrived, yet the deck was a battlefield of subtle power shifts. A glance, a pause, a raised eyebrow, every gesture was amplified, charged with tension. The first spark had ignited. Authority versus experience, bluster versus precision, pride versus proven skill. And in that quiet, charged moment, it became painfully clear. No one would get through the night without acknowledging who truly commanded the ship. The storm arrived quietly at first, rolling in with distant rumbles that seemed almost polite, masking the chaos it would bring. The sea, once steady, had begun to swell, pressing against the hull in slow, relentless surges. Rain started as a whisper, tapping lightly on the metal deck, then quickly evolved into a drumming roar, rattling hatches and whipping sails into frenzied motion. Inside the command center, the crew's chatter dissolved into murmurs of tension, their faces reflecting fear they barely understood themselves. The captain stood rigid at the helm, his chest tight, his fingers gripping the rail as if sheer force could control the elements. For hours, he had relied on volume and presence, barking orders, expecting obedience. Yet in the subtle light of storm-laden clouds, that authority felt tenuous, almost brittle. His eyes flicked to the young officer, who moved with deliberate, unshakable calm. Every command she issued was precise, every instruction measured, her voice cutting through the panic like a scalpel through fog. "What are you doing differently?" he demanded, finally breaking the fragile silence between them. His tone carried frustration, a mixture of curiosity and pride bruised by his own uncertainty. She didn't flinch. Her gaze held his, steady and unwavering. "Priorities. Focus. Anticipation," she replied softly, almost as if listing mundane facts, yet each word carried weight, an unspoken challenge. The crew listens because they trust the outcome, not the volume. The captain's jaw tightened. For the first time, the dynamic he relied on, ego, bluster, unchallenged control, began to erode under her quiet competence. He barked again, sharper this time, trying to assert dominance, yet the crew followed her first. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Every eye, every hand, every hesitant pause reflected the new order of authority forming on the deck. Hours passed in this tense ballet. He observed her, noting the small adjustments she made to instruments, the calm gestures that corrected the minor missteps of panicked sailors. He realized the depth of her experience, far beyond any medal worn on a chest. The moment demanded more than compliance. It demanded judgment, courage, and moral clarity. And she displayed all three without a word of self-promotion. In the quiet lulls between lightning strikes, he caught himself reflecting. How often had he relied on noise rather than knowledge? How many times had pride eclipsed prudence? The storm became a mirror, exposing the fragility of ego, the hollowness of authority unearned. When the first real crisis struck, a sudden surge threatening to cripple the rudder, he saw her take immediate action, delegating tasks with exacting precision. He barked orders, but they went unheeded. Instinctively, the crew followed her. Panic trembled across his chest. For the first time, he felt powerless. The realization stung, sharp as the wind cutting across the deck. His authority was a veneer, thin and brittle, now overshadowed by quiet mastery. The shift was not dramatic, not violent. It was a quiet, deliberate reordering of respect. Where once her presence had been overlooked, now it commanded the entire vessel. Where once he had assumed control, he now had to reckon with competence and integrity, with accountability and skill surpassing rank. And as the storm continued its relentless assault, he began to reflect not with anger, but with reluctant admiration. By the time dawn broke, the ship had survived intact. The storm had passed, leaving slick steel, dripping ropes, and exhausted sailors behind. The captain, drenched, stood silently beside the young officer. The medal on her chest glinted faintly in the early light, no longer small, no longer merely symbolic. It was a testament, proof of judgment, courage, and quiet authority. For the first time in years, he spoke without bluster, without sarcasm, without the weight of ego trying to assert itself. "You led them well," he said, voice low, deliberate, almost reverent. I underestimated what you bring to this ship." She nodded, expression unreadable, calm. No celebration, no triumph, only acknowledgement. A subtle shift had occurred, invisible to many but unmissable to those attuned to the currents of leadership and integrity. In the quiet after the storm, the captain recognized something profound. True command is not a title, a loud voice, or a visible display of rank. It is earned in moments of crisis, in measured action, in unwavering calm, and in the courage to lead without seeking credit. By the time the sun touched the horizon fully, the lesson had settled, not just in him, but in every sailor who had witnessed the subtle, deliberate, and undeniable shift in power. The storm had passed, but the reckoning of authority, integrity, and ego would linger far longer. The storm had spent its fury, leaving the deck slick with rain and sea spray, the air heavy with the scent of salt and ozone. The crew moved cautiously, exhausted but alive, each action deliberate after hours of fear and tension. The captain stood near the helm, shoulders tense, watching the young officer issue her final instructions with a calm authority that required no voice raised, no theatrics, no posturing. For hours, he had clung to ego, to the illusion of control, barking orders in an attempt to assert dominance. But now, in the quiet aftermath, he recognized the truth. Authority is not declared, it is earned. The realization came like a wave, sudden and undeniable, washing over him with a mix of humility and awe. Every motion she had made during the crisis had been precise, deliberate, and unshakable. Every command had been met with trust, not fear. He approached her slowly, boots making soft thuds against the wet deck, the usual bravado stripped away. She did not flinch or shift. Her posture remained relaxed but commanding. The glint of her medal caught the light, a small, quiet testament to experience that words alone could not convey. You handled them perfectly," he said, voice low, measured, almost hesitant. I didn't understand. I underestimated." She cut him off gently, not with derision, but with calm authority. "It wasn't about proving anything to you," she said softly, eyes steady. "It was about keeping the crew alive. That's the only measure that matters." The words struck him harder than any storm. For the first time, he felt the weight of genuine leadership, the responsibility that comes with true authority. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, yet profound. The balance of power had moved, not through confrontation, but through competence, calm, and integrity. As he stepped back, a quiet respect settled over him, unspoken but absolute. The storm outside had passed, yet inside, something had shifted irrevocably. From that moment, he knew that leadership was not about rank, loudness, or pride. It was about measured action, moral clarity, and the courage to act when it mattered most. In that brief, rain-drenched silence, the ship's true chain of command was no longer a matter of titles or tradition. It was a matter of trust, earned in the eye of the storm. The storm had passed, leaving the deck glistening under a weak morning sun, each drop of water sparkling like fractured glass. The crew moved carefully, subdued but steady, their movements no longer frantic but deliberate, tempered by the events they had survived. The young officer stood near the helm, calm as ever, surveying the ship with eyes that missed nothing. She carried no arrogance, only the quiet dignity of someone who had proven herself in the most extreme test. The captain approached, boots slapping softly against the wet steel, his usual brash confidence replaced by a humility he had rarely experienced. He stopped beside her, looking out toward the horizon, then down at the slick deck. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was reflective, heavy with acknowledgement and newfound understanding. Finally, he spoke, voice low, measured. "You led them well. Better than I could have imagined. Better than I ever have." There was no sarcasm, no posturing, only sincerity. The crew, scattered around the deck, caught sight of the exchange, and in their eyes flickered recognition. Respect had shifted, naturally, without drama, without spectacle. She nodded, not triumphantly, not with a need for validation. "I did what needed to be done," she said softly. "That's all any of us can promise." Word of the storm and the officer's decisive leadership spread quickly through the ranks and eventually reached the Naval Command headquarters. There were no accolades in grand ceremonies, no televised interviews. This was not a tale of revenge or ego. Instead, her competence earned her quiet recognition. Promotions recommended, trust reinforced, and the respect of every crew member who had witnessed the ordeal. The captain, once brash and unchallenged, found himself mentoring differently, learning that leadership was not about volume, but vision, foresight, and calm decisiveness. Back on deck, the crew performed routine checks with a new sense of cohesion, their movements almost synchronized, the tension of before replaced by confidence. The young officer walked among them briefly, offering guidance in small, measured ways, each gesture reinforcing authority through integrity rather than fear. By midday, the sun had burned through the last remnants of storm clouds, casting the ship in warm light. The medal on her chest caught the rays, a subtle gleam of proof, not of ego, but of endurance, courage, and calm mastery. No one celebrated loudly. There was no need. The ship had survived, the crew was safe, and the balance of respect and authority had shifted permanently. In that quiet, reflective aftermath, the lesson was clear. True command is earned in moments of crisis, not declared through words or rank. The storm had tested more than skill, it had tested character, integrity, and moral courage. And in the end, those who led with quiet strength were the ones remembered, long after the wind had faded and the waves had calmed. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, the ship moved steadily through calm waters, but the lessons of the night lingered far longer than the waves. The captain had learned that loud commands and visible authority could only carry someone so far. True leadership required foresight, integrity, and the courage to act without seeking applause. The young officer had demonstrated that power is not claimed by title or rank, but earned through calm decisiveness when it matters most. Every sailor who had followed her orders instinctively understood that respect is stronger than fear, and trust stronger than intimidation. The medal on her chest was not a symbol of pride, but a quiet testament to experience, moral courage, and the willingness to take responsibility when lives hung in the balance. Authority without wisdom falters. Ego without accountability crumbles. And in the eye of the storm, it is the steady, disciplined hand, the calm, unassuming presence, that saves not just a ship, but everyone aboard it. True leadership isn't worn on a chest or announced from a podium. It is proven silently, in moments when the world is falling apart, and only integrity can keep it together.